Welcome back to Great Clacton's Ask a Pastor. I'm T, and we are right now in the middle of a series where we are looking at the question of who wrote the books of the Bible. And we've started with the New Testament because that's a really good place to start if you're just reading the Bible for the first time. And I've gone through most of the New Testament over the last 2 weeks. There are only 5 books of the New Testament that are left to look at. And I purposely saved those for last. And those 5 are the Gospel of John, the letters 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, and then the final book in the Bible, Revelation. Now, all 5 of these books have something in common, which is why I wanted to talk about them all together. And the thing that they have in common is that all 5 of these are traditionally believed to have been written by someone named John. And I will come right out and say that I also believe that each of these 5 books was written by someone named John. But there is a lot more to it than that. I think the first thing that we want to do when we consider who wrote these books is to see what the Bible itself tells us. Now, I'm not talking about the titles of the book. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But actually what is written in the books themselves. Or also remembering that 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John aren't really books as such. They were letters that were written to churches. So, what do these books of the Bible say about who wrote them? Well, the Gospel of John never identifies the writer of the Gospel. Not specifically by name. 1 John doesn't mention who wrote it. 2 John and 3 John only say that they were written by someone who referred to himself as the elder. And then Revelation is the only one that actually says in the book itself that it was written by someone named John. In fact, he says it 5 times just to make it really clear that we know that it was written by someone named John. So ironically, out of all 5 of these books that are traditionally believed to have been written by someone named John, the only one that says in the text it was written by John is also the only one that doesn't have John in the title. Anyway, it is also worth noting right here up front that the book of Revelation is very different to all of these other 4 books that are attributed to John. And it's not just the fact that the author identifies himself in Revelation and the author doesn't identify himself by name in the other books. It's also not just the fact that Revelation, the genre of book that it is so different to anything else in the New Testament. But it's more than that. The style of writing, the word choices, the structure of Revelation, even the way that the writer explains and expresses faith is very, very different to the way those same things are done by the writers of the Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And so we probably have at least 2 different people named John who wrote the books that we attribute to John traditionally. So if none of the other 4 books, we're going to leave Revelation aside for now. We will come back to it at the end. But if we leave that aside for now, and we look at the other 4 books, Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, if the text itself does not say they were written by John, why does the title say that it's John? And it's important to remember that when people wrote the books of the Bible, or people wrote the letters that we have in the Bible, they didn't title them. Nobody put a title down and then started to write what they had to write. The titles were given much later in history by people who wanted to make it easy to identify which document we're talking about, and also to identify who the writer of those documents were. Because when the first people to receive the letters, for example, from John, would have known who they were from. And even if he didn't put his name down on the document itself, they would have known who had sent them those letters. Likewise, they would have known, the first people to read the gospel would have known who it was who had written it. And so they didn't need to have a name attached to begin with. But then as these documents were copied and passed on to more and more churches all around the known world, at some point people realized, well, we should probably make a note of who wrote this so that the people that don't know, the people that are going to receive it later on, will have an idea of why they should take it seriously. And so that's when sort of titles and cover pages and notes would be attached to these documents as they were sent to other churches. And so from the very earliest history, we have been told these sort of notes that were attached to these texts have said that these books were written by someone named John. And so as far back as we can trace, Christians have always believed that these texts were written by someone named John. And in fact, in just the late 2nd century, which is only about 150, 160 years after Jesus died, one of the great early church leaders, a man named Irenaeus, he wrote about how John, the disciple of the Lord, had written a gospel. And Irenaeus was not just passing on a traditional belief, or he's not just repeating something that he read in a note attached to one of the documents that he had, that he just assumed to be true. Actually, Irenaeus had gotten this information that the disciple John had written a gospel. He had gotten that from a man named Polycarp. Polycarp was another great church leader who had died just 50 years before Irenaeus wrote this. And Polycarp himself had spoken directly with John before John had died at an old age at around the turn of the 2nd century, about 70 years after Jesus' resurrection. So you have a very, very short chain between the gospel itself and Irenaeus, because the writer of the gospel had met with a young Polycarp towards the end of his life, and then later an older Polycarp had taught a young Irenaeus towards the end of his life, and told him about how he had met with John, and about how John had been a disciple of the Lord, and how John had written the gospel. So the Gospel of John, and by association most likely the epistles of John, the letters written by John, were almost definitely written by a disciple of Jesus named John. But we're still left with the question of which one. As I said, there's a reason I saved all these books for last, because figuring out which John wrote these books is more complicated than most people realize. And what makes it even more complicated is that most Christians don't think that it's complicated at all, and so they don't even stop to consider the question because they think they already know the answer. In fact, if you've spent any significant amount of time in church, then most likely you've probably heard many, many, many times that these books were all written by the Apostle John. And the Apostle John, he is the brother of James, the son of a man named Zebedee, and he was one of Jesus' inner circle. Not just one of the 12 apostles, but one of the 3 who spent the most time with him. But this Apostle John was not the only John that is written about in the New Testament. In fact, John was the most popular men's name among Jews at the time, and so the name comes up over and over and over again. In just the New Testament documents that we have, you have John the Apostle, who I was talking about, the brother of James, son of Zebedee. you have John the Baptist, who was Jesus' cousin. He was the one that was sent before Jesus to prepare the way for Jesus, to tell people that he's coming, that the Lord is coming. You also have John, whose other name was Mark, who you'll remember from a couple of weeks ago, is the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark. And he's usually referred to as Mark to avoid confusion with the other Johns that they would have known. And then you have someone named John who was part of the high priest's family that Luke talks about in Acts 4. But then you also have the father of the apostles Peter and Andrew, whose name was John. But it's worth noting that in the Greek, so the original version that the New Testament was written in, Peter and Andrew's father, John, has a different form of the name than all the other Johns. And it may be that it was just a different name altogether that sounded similar. Or it could be a different way of writing the same name, but written differently, again, to try to avoid confusion with all the other Johns that were out there. So we have at least 4, maybe 5 people in the New Testament who are specifically named John. But those are just the people that the writers of the New Testament thought were important enough that it was worth writing down their name for us to know. We actually have no idea how many other people in Jesus' life might also have had the name John, because there could have been other Johns that were just not mentioned because they didn't play a large enough role in the key events of Jesus' ministry that they needed to be mentioned. But there might also have been other Johns who were simply called by another name in the New Testament so as to avoid confusion with the Johns who were named. Just like, as I said, Mark, his name was John, but he's almost always referred to as Mark because there were so many other Johns, but really only one Mark in the early Christian community. But most people assume that out of all these Johns that we know about, and the ones that we might not even know about, they assume that the writer of the Gospel is the Apostle John. And that's because he was not just part of Jesus' inner circle of 12, but he was in that exclusive club of 3 who witnessed some things that none of the other apostles witnessed, such as Jesus' transfiguration. And that was John, his older brother James, and then Peter. And that theory that John, who was one of the 3 closest apostles, was also the writer of the Gospel of John, has been repeated over and over and over again for so long that most people assume that the Gospel itself must say that it was written by the Apostle John. And it really makes sense why so many people would assume that it was written by John. Because who would know Jesus better than one of his 3 closest apostles? And Irenaeus, as I told you, who knew Polycarp, who had spoken directly with the John who had written the Gospel, seems to confirm that it was the Apostle John who wrote it. Or does he? Do you remember that when I told you earlier what Irenaeus had written, he wrote that John, who had written the Gospel, was the disciple of the Lord. Not that it was John, an apostle of the Lord. And now, I did discuss a couple of weeks ago the difference between disciples and apostles because they're not the same thing. And the fact that they're often used interchangeably even though they aren't the same thing, and that can lead to some confusion. If you didn't watch that, I recommend you go back and watch it at some point. But enough to say that it might seem like an insignificant difference referring to someone as a disciple or an apostle, but it's not insignificant. If Irenaeus had said that John, the apostle of the Lord, had written a gospel, then we would know for certain that it was John, brother of James, son of Zebedee, who had written the Gospel of John, because that John was the only apostle named John. However, Irenaeus described the writer of the Gospel as a disciple of the Lord. And you have to remember that Jesus had at least 70, probably many, many more, but at least 70 male disciples. And the chances are pretty high that at least one of them, if not more, also had the name John. And in fact, we do know that there was at least one other John among Jesus' disciples. There was another early church leader named Papias, who lived at about the same time that Polycarp did. And remember, Polycarp had actually met with the John who wrote the gospel. And so these men were alive at a time when there was still some of Jesus' actual apostles and disciples still living towards the end of their lives. That Papias, who knew some of the disciples, and he knew of the apostles, he made a distinct difference between the Apostle John and another disciple of Jesus who was known as John the Elder. And that title might sound familiar to you. If you remember, I told you that the letter 2 John and letter 3 John, they don't say the name of the person who wrote them, but the person who wrote them refers to himself as the elder. So it's very, very likely that 2 John and 3 John were written by that disciple that Papias knew about, John the Elder, because tradition tells us that it was written by someone named John, and the writer himself identifies himself as the elder. So if John the Elder wrote 2 John and 3 John, then it's almost certain that it was that man, John the Elder, who wrote 1 John, but also the Gospel of John. And if that's true, that would mean that the Apostle John didn't write any of these 4 books. And the suggestion I know might shock some of you. After all, as I've said, most of us have always been told with certainty in church that it was the Apostle John who wrote these books. But I want you to consider something for a moment. I'm not going to ask you to do the homework, but it might be interesting for you to at some point. But if you read through the Gospels, all 4 Gospel accounts, and you pay attention to what the Gospels actually say about the Apostle John, about John, the brother of James, son of Zebedee, then you will notice that from what the Bible says, he's not actually that important. All right, I want to clarify. Yes, obviously, the Apostle John was very, very important. All of Jesus' disciples were important. The 12 apostles were extremely important, and the 3 closest apostles were more important than any of the other apostles. So yes, John had a place of importance in Jesus' ministry. But beyond that, the Gospels don't tell us that John had any further significance. That is, among Jesus' 3 closest apostles, John, James, and Peter, John actually seems to be the least important based on what's actually written in the Gospels. Because Peter is the one who's chosen to lead Jesus' people after Jesus returns to heaven. And John is just James's little brother. There's nothing in the Gospels as written that would give John any greater significance than that would give him an even more special role in the life of Jesus. But the reason that the Apostle John is venerated so much is because people believe that he is the beloved disciple. So now I'll explain what the beloved disciple is. About halfway through the Gospel of John, a character appears, a man appears who is referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And he appears 6 times, and it is clear from what he does and from what he is called that this beloved disciple has a special role in Jesus' life and ministry. And most scholars believe that this beloved disciple is the way that the author of the gospel referred to himself. So he didn't put his name in the gospel, but when he appeared in the action that's being explained, that's being described, that he would just refer to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And because it has been believed for such a long time that John, the son of Zebedee, had written the gospel, then it's also believed that he played this special role as being Jesus' beloved disciple. And once that idea takes root, it actually reinforces itself cyclically, because we think that John, the son of Zebedee, must have written the gospel because we believe that he was the beloved disciple, and so he would have had a closer relationship with Jesus, so he could have written this gospel. But the problem with that is he's only associated with the beloved disciple because people thought that he wrote the gospel. Once you break that loop, though, and consider that someone else might have written the gospel, then you can see that there's actually no special reason to think that John, the son of Zebedee, had written it, except that he happened to share the name with someone, the man who did write it. But this can be really, really tricky to unpick because, and this is the reason I bring it up, because I do think this is a very important point to make. Oftentimes, our understanding of what's in the Bible is confused between what is really written in the Bible and what we think is written in the Bible. And when we mix these two together, then our understanding of what's really there gets confused between what God really wanted to tell us and between what we want to find there. And the more we can identify ourselves doing this, then the easier it is for us to really get to the heart of what the truth is about God. And it's worth thinking about the identification of John, John the Apostle, son of Zebedee, as the beloved disciple in this way, because most people in the church think that the Bible itself tells us that John is the beloved disciple. And so people will preach about John and describing him as the beloved disciple, or they'll preach about the beloved disciple and say, oh, and this was the Apostle John. But the Bible itself does not tell us that at all. That's an assumption that we make based on the traditional belief that the John who wrote the gospel was John the Apostle, son of Zebedee. But the Bible itself doesn't tell us that. And it's very dangerous for us to assume that it does, especially when we really have no proof that it was John the Apostle. It's only the traditional belief that it was him. So, laying my own cards at the table, I don't think that the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the Gospel of John or any of the epistles of John. And there's a lot of reasons why I think that, and I definitely do not have time to get into all those in this particular video. But here's one reason. One reason why, and a big reason, why I don't think that it was the Apostle John who wrote the Gospel of John. And that is, the Apostle John was a fisherman from Galilee. In fact, all of Jesus' apostles were from Galilee. That is the region of Palestine where a lot of Jesus' ministry took place. It's where Jesus was raised in Nazareth in Galilee. And it was in the north, and you had the area of Samaria, where the Samaritans lived, down below that. And then below that was Judea, where you had the capital of Jerusalem. And there was quite a difference between life in Galilee and life down here in Judea, especially around Jerusalem. That most of the people in Galilee, and especially most of Jesus' apostles, were just working class, not especially educated. And John was one of them. He was a fisherman, not even any kind of special fisherman. It's just working class fisherman. He worked alongside his brother James and their friends Andrew and Peter until Jesus said to them, you know what, I've got something better for you. Come with me. You're going to catch people for me. Now, in what we call the Synoptic Gospels, those are the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, almost all of the descriptions of Jesus' ministry are of the things that Jesus did and said in and near Galilee. So they're from the perspective of his Galilean apostles, who would have been with him from the beginning and stayed with him through most of his ministry and seen the things that happened in Galilee. But that's not the focus in John. In the Gospel of John, most of the action takes place in or near Jerusalem. And in fact, we hardly hear anything at all about what happened in Galilee. And so most likely, the Gospel of John was written not by one of the Galilean apostles or even one of the Galilean disciples, but by one of Jesus' disciples who lived in or near Jerusalem and would have not been with Jesus the entire time during his ministry in Galilee, but would have been there witnessing everything that went on in Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem. And the reason why we believe that the Gospel of John was written by someone who lived in or near Jerusalem was because of the intimate knowledge that the writer had, not just of the physical layout of the city of Jerusalem, but also of just all the social aspects of what life was like living in Jerusalem. So, to summarize, contrary to tradition, I do not think that the Gospel of John was written by the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, the Galilean, but rather I think that the Gospel of John was written by a disciple of Jesus who lived in Jerusalem, who came to be known as John the Elder. And I do believe that the same person wrote the letters of John. But, and this is really, really, really important, whether I'm right or wrong, it doesn't really matter. Whether these documents were written by the Apostle John or another disciple named John doesn't change the most important fact. And that fact is that these documents, the gospel and the letters, were written by someone who knew Jesus intimately. Someone who actually knew Jesus. So when you open up the Gospel of John, you're not reading a dry religious text. You're not reading a made-up story. You're reading a first-hand account of someone who actually lived through these events. Someone who knew Jesus well enough that he could lean against him. Someone who knew what it was like to walk and talk with the living Lord. And these words are his account of everything that happened. A first-hand account, which is why we believe them to be true. Now, whoever it is, the Apostle John, John the Elder, some other John, that person probably didn't write Revelation. So who did write Revelation? And the answer to that is, I have no idea. We do know it was written by someone named John. He makes it abundantly clear that that's true. But as I said, John was the most common name among Jews at that time. And the author does not identify himself in any way at all. He doesn't identify himself as a disciple of Jesus. He doesn't identify himself as an apostle of Jesus. The only thing we know about him is that he was exiled to the island of Patmos for preaching about Jesus. And that while he was there, God gave him a vision of the spiritual realm and of the ultimate victory over death, the devil, and sin. So, maybe it was the Apostle John who wrote Revelation. But it could also have been any number of other people. So we don't really know for certain. And as I said, if you want to know more reasons why I don't think John the Apostle wrote the Gospel of John, or if you're interested in finding out who I think the beloved disciple really is, do let me know, because I find this all very fascinating and I'd love to dig down deeper into that at some point with anyone that would like to. But for now, we are going to move on in our series, and I'm going to take a break from looking at who wrote the books of the Bible. We'll come back to that in a few weeks, but we're going to start looking at how we know that we can trust the biblical documents that we have in hand now. So we'll start that next week. I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.